All right,
Hey,
here we are.
under the watchful eyes of white Jesus.
Yes, with long hair. We'll
Do
talk
you know?
about that
Have you
later.
ever looked into why icons of Jesus are white?
No.
It happened around the time of the Crusades. A lot of people think it was a guy by the name of Cesare Borgia. He was an illegitimate son of a pope. But when they sent the European Crusaders to Palestine to fight the Crusades, everybody, before then, all the icons were very dark.
Right.
And it didn't make very much sense
Middle
to send
Eastern.
Europeans to kill people who looked like the icons of Jesus that they had been bowing down to.
Oh,
So they
interesting.
Europeanized the
Right.
iconography so that Jesus didn't look like the people they were killing. Looked
That's
like the
interesting.
people they were fighting for,
Yeah,
not
that-
against.
That one of my favorite books in the world that you recommended, On Killing, talks about one of the ways that you need to convince yourself to kill somebody is to make them separate from yourself,
Right.
right? You are who you are, and they're animals who rape babies. And
Yep.
so they gotta look like you, they look like animals. All right.
So it's either a good or a bad thing. Like the capacity for Jesus to identify with different groups of people, I suppose, in net terms is a good thing, but when it's used for
Right, but
violence,
now
that's
if
a
I
bad
were
thing.
if I were to make a black Jesus, people would have no idea what that was.
Or even a Middle Eastern
now it is
Jesus.
just absolutely
Yeah.
the white Jesus, the blue eyes,
Right.
long hair. Yeah, we'll talk about that another time when we talk about why you look the way you do, freaking hipster. All right, welcome to Talking in the Chasm. Controversial, compassionate conversation between best friends. Holy man.
And an atheist.
All right, I'm Felix.
And I'm Matthew.
And
we have access to this cool building, so we just kind
Yes.
of roam around, find a little nook and cranny to be.
Matthew has an office in this amazing church.
Uh-huh.
And so we're going to have a different background each time, I hope. It's always going to be cool.
So this week, what should we talk
So,
about?
I was thinking about talking about hell. It's always something that sort of interested me. It just seems like a very lopsided concept. And then there's an atheist, and I don't know her name, that Sarah, my wife, listens to a podcast, and she said that hell is an infinite punishment for a finite sin.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think that's a fascinating concept to talk about. If the Lord forgives you for any transgression,
Mm-hmm.
then at what point is there no longer a possibility of redemption? You know, at what point are you burning in hell for eternity? And hell is a New Testament thing, not an Old Testament, right? This eternal torture punishment thing.
I would say it this way: the New Testament picks up where the Old Testament leaves off. So what I would say about Old Testament theology of the afterlife is that there's very distinct concepts of reward and punishment, but there's not very much definition to that terminology. There is more definition and more of an emphasis on eternality in the New Testament in the way that it talks about the afterlife.
Is there a heaven in the Old Testament?
Again, it's just reward and punishment. This is a good place maybe to begin to talk about. And the part of the problem is that a lot of Christians aren't even very well informed about what the Bible teaches about the afterlife. A lot of us learned what we learned that quote unquote Christianity teaches in Sunday schools and stories and more like pop Christian culture than actually from the Bible. What the Bible teaches is that so let's start with the Old Testament concepts. In Hebrew it's called Sheol, which is the place of the dead. And within Sheol, the prophetic writers, David in particular, have a very clear sense of some kind of justice. So there will be a good place for the righteous and a bad place for the unrighteous. And that's talked about very much. But that's really all it is. There's good for the righteous and bad for the unrighteous in the afterlife. Very little definition aside from that. When we come to the New Testament, that term Sheol has a Greek counterpart, which is Hades. And you're used to that from Greek mythology,
Right.
like the river Styx and Hades
Mm-hmm.
beyond. And it's conceptually the same thing. It's the place of the dead. In the New Testament conception, Jesus teaches a specific story. It's called the story of Lazarus and the rich man, where a rich man lives this luxurious life, and Lazarus is a beggar. And Lazarus sits at the rich man's gate every day and begs for crumbs from the table. He has leprosy and sores, and the dogs come and lick his wounds. And then one night they both die. And it says that an angel comes and takes Lazarus to a place that it refers to as Abraham's bosom, or paradise, the place where Abraham's, connoting the place for the righteous. And it says that the rich man lifted up his eyes in torment. And so the man in torment says he can see Lazarus and in Abraham's bosom, and he tells Lazarus, could you put your finger in water and touch my tongue, because I'm so thirsty. And Abraham says to him, you know that there's a great gulf fixed between us and you can't come over here and we can't go over there. So the place of the dead is separated by this big chasm or some border, and they can't cross over. What he says then is, okay, well, if you can't help me, send Lazarus back to the living to tell my brothers so they don't end up here where I am. And the response of Abraham is, they have Moses and the prophets. If they wouldn't hear Moses and the prophets, they wouldn't hear one returning from the dead.
How did he end up there?
The rich man?
Yeah.
Well, the summation at the end that Abraham gives is that you in your life had good things and Lazarus evil. And now in this life, he's in paradise and you're in torment.
Right. So again,
So this updates, and then there's a few other concepts in the New Testament where Jesus talks about, he gives certain very severe warnings. They're usually about these really unjust things that happen. Like, for instance, there's a story that Jesus tells where a servant comes into a king's chamber, and the king says, you owe me 10,000 talents. That's a lot of money. That's like a treasure chest full of money. And he says, pay that you owe me. And the guy says, be patient with me, have mercy. He falls on his feet, he cries, he does the whole waterworks thing. He says, I'll pay, just have mercy on me. And the king says, I forgive you. And he leaves. And then that guy goes out and he finds his fellow servant who owes him 10 talents, 1,000th of this money. Mm-hmm. And he grabs him by the throat and he chokes him and says, give me what you owe. And he says, have mercy, just like happened before. And this time, that guy throws his fellow servant into debtor's prison until he pays. And the king hears about this and says, bring that unprofitable servant back here. He'll be bound and cast into outer darkness, where there should be weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth, where the worm dieth not. So this is all concepts of like this eternal punishment. Now, so those are, and then one of the last earmarks for the Bible's discourse on this is the end of all things. It's the eschaton, is like the whole framework of God's working with people, and the end of the eschaton is like when the last pieces of data that we have from the Bible are that the last things to be destroyed. So there's this big confrontation between good and evil, between God and the people that hate him, and there's this battle that happens, and then God's enemies are done away with. And one of the last things that happens is a marriage supper. So there's like this feast, this great thing for all of God's people. And it says that death and Hades, the place of the dead, are cast into the lake of fire. Like they're done away with forever. So there's no more death and there's no more place of the dead. That's kind of like God's last thing in the eschaton, is take those things and to throw them in eternal judgment. And it says there that there are certain things there that the smoke of that torment ascends forever and ever. So there's some kind of continual notion for this, but this is a hotly debated issue within Christian circles, in history and contemporarily. What that exactly means is not a settled matter in Christian circles. There's some variation on how different Christian people approach that subject. So I'll try to represent kind of like my views
Right, yeah.
and talk about some of the range of views that people have.
Right. Okay. Well, so I guess as an atheist, when I think about why people need religion, okay, we've talked about this a little bit before, but I feel like people are afraid, like genuinely afraid of chaos, right? Of just randomness, that just your baby just gets cancer and dies for no reason. I mean, so that's a horrible thing, but it gives you comfort to think, well, God has a plan, God has a reason, now he's with God or whatever, right? So it just makes you feel better. So it kind of helps you get through the day, I suppose. It's a little bit of like, if I do good, I get rewarded. If I do bad, I get punished. It's maybe a little bit of that, but I'm not really sure how much I think that actually factors into it. But the concept of hell, for me, when I think about why it was created, is so that when somebody murders your daughter and you never find that person,
you can expect
right?
justice.
You can just tell yourself, well, God saw it, right? God knows who it is, and he'll be punished forever in hell. So I feel like there's going to be justice no matter what, because God is just and there will be justice, whether it's earthly or not. At least I can feel comfortable with the idea that he's an evil person, and evil people get punished. Okay. So, but what this woman was saying, and what one of the problems I have with the concept of hell in that parable about the rich man is that he gets, the one person is poor and in misery during the lifetime and then is rewarded forever after, and the other person is rich and greedy and awful in the lifetime and then he's punished forever after. Well, give me the boils, because life is this long and eternity is eternity.
That's the point.
So it's a finite sin, and it's an eternal punishment. Right? So that's one problem, right? I murder you, and then, or whatever. I steal. Any of these things. These are things that I do that are finite. They exist in a short amount of time, and afterwards I'm still a person. I can still repent. I can change. I can forget. Whatever. But once you're in hell, that's it. You're tormented forever and ever and ever, which just seems completely lopsided and completely unjust and just outrageous. And it seems to fly in the face of the idea that everyone can be redeemed and that God will forgive everyone who is truly repentant. Once you're in hell, how can you repent? I mean, when you're in the lake of fire, you know what I mean? So, and heaven is the same way. It's like, who goes to heaven? Is there anybody who's a really good person all the way through? Of course not. We all have evil thoughts. So the idea of a finite crime and a infinite punishment, to me, I can't justify. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. Like, how can you believe in a hell, or even a creature that would cast judgment, forever?
Well,
especially if you think about the fact that you're tortured and in misery and agony and burning all the time.
My question is this, to that incredulity, is that whether or not that's right, I suppose is a question of morality, but that it is matches exactly how my experience in the world is. For instance, if you were to kill me, that's a finite action with an eternal result. Like, the fact of finite decisions producing eternal results. Like, if you kill me, I never come back to life. That's a done thing.
Right.
So the fact that we connect these...
If you murder, you cannot be redeemed.
Right. Well,
period.
No,
never. Because you will always be dead.
Right.
So therefore, I should be punished forever, no matter what.
Well, I think
there is no redemption for me.
That doesn't jive with Christian theology. We do think that there is redemption for those big actions, but what I would say in response to the critique that this idea that finite sins produce infinite judgment is that we're used to that in the nature of reality. that some finite decision. I mean, if I steal your cheeseburger and eat it, that's a finite action with an infinite result. Like, the world is made of finite actions that produce infinite results.
Right.
That's how the world is. And so the fact that the afterlife matches my experience in reality is not surprising to me. Like, for instance, if I commit suicide or if I kill someone, or, there are different actions that have different ramifications, and some of the actions have really big ramifications, and some of our actions have really small ramifications. But this concept of what we do here and now matters in the future and indefinitely. What I would say, the way that I rationalize the idea of afterlife and judgment and reward and punishment in the afterlife, is that what I think God does is that the accumulation of all of those decisions, not just the good ones and not just the bad ones, but all of those decisions. There's actually a verse that says, or is appointed unto man once to die, and after this the judgment. And it says that we shall give an account for the deeds done in our body, whether they be good or evil. Paul wrote that in Corinthians. And so what the judgment is, like, I think that in the West in particular, we have this notion of judgment being like some kind of like Zeus type mythological creature pointing here's a better concept for what we think of as judgment, is like you remember Gladiator? And when he has the guy on the ground and the Caesar gets to decide if it's thumbs up or thumbs down. Like, I think that's the ideal concept of Western notions of the judgment of God. And I don't think of it that way. At least I don't anymore. I grew up with that notion. But what I think is that men are miracles. All of us. The fact that we're common does not make us unmiraculous in my perspective. I think that all men are miracles. And part of the miracle is that we're so vastly complicated. And the outworking of figuring out what the value of a person is. Like, how do you measure responsibility, privilege, intellect, personality, experience? How do you leverage all those infinite variables nearly infinite variables in every person's life that are unique and discrete to that person, and come away with some kind of understanding? Like, there's all kinds of ways that we think about this, right? So, like, for my conservative friends, when they talk about responsibility, right? Like, we need to be personal responsibility. It's a big thing with politically conservative people, and for good reasons. You can have a big impact on your life by how much responsibility you take for your actions, but it doesn't take into account all these things. Like typically white middle class conservatives in America are like, why this drug problem? Cops should just shut these people down, or something horrible happens in a bad neighborhood. And it's like, why did they live there? They should have been doing something else with their life. All these kinds of thoughts about personal responsibility, and what you say from compassion is like, but you don't know what it's like growing up on a couch. You don't know what it's like growing up with those men around. You don't know what it's like growing up until you've identified with what it means to be from that place, you can't assess accurately how hard it is to make any given decision that's good or bad. And I think the judgment is the ultimate version of that. And I do think that there are consequences, but the most important thing about the judgment to me is to have that sum from the Creator. Like, when I put all of your life together, when I take all that you are, all that you had, all that you could have been, and all that you were, and the thoughts of your mind, the actions of your decisions, and I put all of those things together, God's the only one that can make that analysis. God's the only one that can say what that is or isn't. And that's what I think the judgment is about.
Well, in the verse that you recited, it talks about, weighing the good with the bad, mm-hmm. right? And to me, it just feels like there's this creature in the sky, right? Zeus with the bolts, with a little tally going, okay, that was good, oh, that was bad, that was good, that was bad, bad, good, no, and then in the end, you tally it up and go, oh, hell for you. And that seems maybe arbitrary, but it just flies in the face of this idea of redemption. That's the only thing. I mean, if I spend a life of rape and murder and torture and lying and stealing and cheating, and then I find Jesus and I completely repent, and I then spend the 2 weeks of my life preaching the gospel, am I still going to hell? Because when you add up all the bad with the good, it weighs heavily towards the bad. So is there no redemption for that person?
No, there for sure is. The idea of redemption is dealing with those things before the judgment. And so, and I think the reason that doesn't sit well with a lot of people is because there's been such a cheap notion of what that means. So let me give you a biblical story of redemption. The Apostle Paul, before he became a Christian, was a Jew who was trained at least by the Sanhedrin. He was a very, very orthodox, observant Jew. And this new Christian sect was a huge problem for the Jews, especially in Jerusalem. And he actually was involved in rounding up Christians for persecution. Like the guy that wrote 2/3 of the New Testament was a man who was responsible for the deaths of the first Christians. In fact, the very first martyr, the very first person killed for this new sect of the Jews, the Christians, his name was Stephen. And Paul says that he was consenting to his death. Like the process of putting Stephen to death, Paul was a part of. And so here's a murder of the first Christian people. But what happens to him when he has a miraculous experience with God? He's actually traveling to persecute the church. And a bright light shines and blinds him. He can't see. And God speaks to him and says, Saul, why are you persecuting me? God says that to him about what he's doing. And so he lays up for 3 days. He's blind, can't see, like dealing with everything that he thought that he was doing for God. He was actually doing against God. And he comes out of that experience, gets baptized, becomes a Christian. At first, nobody will believe him because they just think it's a undercover plot. And like this literally happens in the church. Right. Like nobody will listen to him until he proves himself. But he spends the rest of his life on the other end of that spectrum, being persecuted, having stones thrown at him. And
right.
So redemption isn't just like, it's not a parlor trick. It doesn't just make the bad go away. It's not actually redemption if it doesn't change the person. And I think this is something intrinsic to all people that we want. So like there's another story that it fascinates me. Gandhi in South Africa was he had come from Oxford, I think it was Oxford, where he trained as a barrister, and then he went to South Africa. And most of his friends, and maybe I've told you this before, but most of his friends were Christians at that time. He actually saw a very famous preacher named Andrew Murray from South Africa. And his friends and the people he hung out with were mostly European Christians. And he was in a very like Eurocentric phase. He wanted to be like under the banner of the Queen. Like he was very much a part of the empire. Is how he saw himself at that phase. And it's his disappointment with how that goes, especially for his people in South Africa, that causes all the problems, that cause him to reconsider what it means to be Indian and all these things. But during that time, he tells a story in his autobiography, which is called Experiments with Truth. He tells a story of going to a Christian Brethren guy's house. And when he went there for supper, this guy says to him, "You poor Indians, you're so bothered by your sins. So for us Christians, we just say we're sorry to God and our sins go away." And Gandhi says, and I think this is why this is a huge missed opportunity for the Christian gospel, Gandhi says, "I could never be content with just covering over my sins. There is something broken inside of me." He starts his autobiography with this, and that's why he tells the story. He says that I recognize there's something broken inside of me, and I would never be content just covering it over. I have to find out what that is and fix it. That's what he wanted. And that's real redemption, is to actually change what's broken inside of people. And so I do believe that redemption can happen on very short time scales. I've seen it happen in people's lives. But it's not actually redemption if the person doesn't actually change. And I think that's a great hope in this world, that a murderer can really set his life right. But setting his life right doesn't mean he gets away with it. Setting his life right means like what it meant for Paul to be a murderer. It meant to dedicate whatever was left of his life to setting those things in order and doing more good than he did bad. That's redemption.
Yeah. If there's time.
Yeah.
You know. So about the Paul thing, Paul was, pretty evil, right? And then God knocked him off his horse.
Mm-hmm.
Why didn't God knock Charlie Manson off his horse?
Or Jeffrey Dahmer or anybody else.
Yeah, I mean, great for Paul. It's just sort of like, what we talked about a long time ago. What is the downside? What is the downside of God appearing to all of us and just saying, I'm here, I am God, I exist, here I am? I would totally believe that. I have no problem, right? He chose Paul. That seems arbitrary. That just seems completely, and then we'll talk about Jeffrey Dahmer in a second, but what do you think about why God...
Why doesn't he?
I mean, the reason that Paul converted, obviously, is because this force blinded him, and okay, you have proven your existence to me. You threw me off my horse and blinded me. Okay, I get it.
I don't know, so I don't want to claim knowledge that I don't have. I don't want to just talk on things that are... But I can guess at some speculative reasons why that might be. I think that there's that I'm what's called an open theist, and so I don't know if I've talked to you about this before, but I think we even mentioned it here. I think that the future is open. I don't think I'm not a determinist. I don't think that the future is settled and God's like a cosmic voyeur reading the future from a perspective of history. I think that the future is predicated on all of our actions, including God's. And so what that means is that there's things afoot. Like
I think that just incidentally, the vast majority of religion on this earth would disagree with that notion. Especially Christian, this idea is it makes God seem not omnipotent. It makes God seem a little bit powerless.
That's a critique against that view.
To say that God, that all of our actions contribute, including God's, it's just like, oh, he's just a participant. He's just one of the guys that throws in some action.
Yeah.
It's cool, but it seems to be very opposite of everything that I've ever heard about as far as Christianity. It's not
how Christianity and omniscience has been talked about. I think it actually makes God stronger. I think the fact that he is engaging in a real world, like, okay, so here's an allegory that gets used in this theological conversation, is like, let's imagine 3 chess masters, right? And the first one, he plays one side, and then he goes around and he plays the other side, and then he wins. Well, like, yeah, duh, you didn't play anybody. You just played yourself. Like, somebody had to win, and it was you. And it was you if you'd lost. Like, that's no big deal. You're not really a master. You're just playing yourself. The other one is the intermediary chess master. He writes a chess program, and he's not playing himself. He's playing his computer. But he wrote the program, right? And so he presses go on the computer side and then plays and he wins. Well, you wrote the code. Like, big surprise. Like, you won. But somebody that no matter who he plays wins. He'll play the computer. He'll play you. He'll play me. There's an open invitation to play anybody in the world, in all of human history, for all of human history. Every natural and supernatural force can play chess with him, and he still wins every time. That's actually a chess master. That's actually someone with power and skill who knows what they're doing. And that's how I would equate this version of foreknowledge, that if God is engaging in a real world where there are real options and there are real potential outcomes that could change and variabilities, that's actually the most omnipotent version of God, because he's playing a fair game and still wins.
Yeah. It's one reason I'm an atheist. That God doesn't seem fair. The whole thing it feels rigged. It's either rigged or it doesn't exist. The idea of God being a participant is just it's fascinating to me. Let's devote an entire show to the sort of clockmaker.
You asked me a specific question. Why doesn't everybody get a Paul experience?
Yes. Okay. Like, why doesn't Charlie Manson get knocked off his horse?
So I would appeal to what Abraham says, and I know the circular reasoning of using the Bible to defend Christian principles, but I'm talking about Christian principles. From within the Christian framework, what we would appeal to is exactly what Abraham says in Abraham's bosom, is that he tells the rich man, they have Moses and the prophets. If they won't hear that, they wouldn't hear one returning from the dead. And I think that's actually, whatever you think of that story, I think it's actually an accurate view of human responses, how we are as people. I think that let's bring it way down from eternity, and let's just talk about COVID and conspiracies and the flat earth. Like how if somebody is of that persuasion, have you ever tried to talk them out of it?
Yeah, it's
a futile attempt.
It's a little bit like I read an article about how left wing people should talk to right wing people, and it's just a completely different sort of world view.
Right.
And a lot, well, especially the flat earthers and stuff, if you are not going to base a decision on empirical evidence, then it's going to be emotional.
Right.
So if my decision is an emotional decision, your talking logic to me makes no difference. It's an emotional decision. It's not a logical decision, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a little bit about how I feel about Trump people and stuff. It's almost like a cult. It's like this, emotional, response to the world. And it doesn't, like the people who deny COVID, you can take them to the hospital and show them piles of bodies. You can give them all the evidence, and evidence isn't part of why they made the decision that they make. You can only talk to them on an emotional level, which is difficult for people to do, because people don't know how to communicate.
I think it's actually much more endemic than even just conservatives. I think I find the same kind of responses and attitudes and actions with my liberal friends.
Those were two separate. I mean,
it's easy to see with COVID.
All the COVID people are politically right. I'm just saying that in the same way that politically right people follow Trump, with no questions, despite the fact that there have been horrible mistakes and things that they won't listen to. Is the same type of reasoning that goes into denying COVID or denying that the Earth is round.
Right. Or on the when for some of us that try to be a little more distanced, like when we watched Obama, for instance, get the Nobel Peace Prize as he's dropping bombs on people all over Yemen, in the first 30 days of his office, those kinds of things, to an objective person, you look and you're like, this is ridiculous. Who doesn't see this? But people don't. We're constantly, no matter where we find ourselves, I think that the human thing, not the liberal or the conservative or it's not bound by ethnicity. I think the human response is to create a worldview. It's so I have people sending me messages from time to time, and they'll ask me, for instance, vaccines are a big issue in conservative Christianity, where I happen to do a lot of my work. And so I get emails from people sometimes that say, hey, we appreciate all the things that you are doing on your sermons and all these teachings, but what do you think about vaccines? And I kind of have a standard response. What I say is that I don't know anything about vaccines. I'm not an immunologist. I'm not a virologist. I'm not a doctor. I can tell you what my friends who are doctors say, and they say get a vaccine. But what I would rather talk to you about is how biased we are by our worldview, and that you're probably looking for an answer that matches what you want to hear. Confirmation bias is huge. Yeah. So the reason for going into this rabbit hole and talking about confirmation bias and the way that we are as people is that I think that Abraham's right. I think that if there were ghosts showing up and bright lights shining every time on the Rotary out here, every Thursday at 5, somebody was getting hit by a bright light, people would think it was an alien, they would think it was mass psychosis, they would think it was whatever.
Because they don't want to believe in God?
I don't actually think that it would make a difference. I think where God invests, so what is a miracle?
Why did it make a difference in Paul?
Well, I think that's something that God was equating, he was evaluating and thought that it would work. I don't know, but
because part of me is like, well, God wants you to worship Him, and He gives you these, little crumbs, like the Bible and the commandments and
but it's not
sermons and
crumbs.
stuff.
Everybody worships God. You look up at the night sky, everybody worships God. You worship something. You say, wow, that's the heart of worship.
Is just being amazed.
Yeah,
Okay.
literally to be amazed. It becomes purposeful worship when it's directed at something. So you can worship a dog, you can worship a tree, you can worship a rock, you can worship Jehovah, you can worship Allah, you can worship whoever. But when you direct that feeling of awe, that awe is the spirit of worship. But when you direct that at something, that becomes religion. That's directed worship.
But it still feels weird that He chose this guy and just, bam, you converted him.
But hey, he was right, right? Like it worked. Right. He wrote 2/3 of the New Testament and spent the rest of his life sacrificing his blood and honor to be doing what he was doing with these ragtag Christians.
Chose correctly. I need just quickly to circle back to the notion of the chess player writing the program. God created the earth.
Right.
God made man. Didn't God program it? Isn't God the programmer? He made man. So He would know, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
To say, well, he's just a participant. No, he's not. He's the programmer.
Well, I mean, we could play with the analogy. We could say, okay, this chess master, he made this chessboard out of his own hands. He carved the pieces out of pieces of stone. Like he spent 1,000 hours on each pawn, and he knows every atom that's in place in the pawn. The question, and if somebody devotes that kind of time and attention and energy into playing chess, I'm going to guess they're really, really good at chess.
Well, that's designing and creating a chessboard and being a chess master are completely different things. You could make a beautiful chessboard and not even know how to play chess.
That's true.
I mean, as you said, God can beat everybody because that's what being a chess master is. Right? However, if everybody he beats, he creates.
Right.
He's the programmer as well. Is he? Did he beat you? He made you. I mean, that goes a little bit into the thing about free will. It's like, well, I mean, do you have free will? He made you. He knows. You can't be omniscient and not and have somebody not know what they're gonna do.
Well, yeah, but we're what's the alternative?
That there's no God
that we
and
don't
that
have
things
a
are
will?
random. Well, no, that there is no God, and that things that we do are random, and the consequences are there or they're not there. I can do whatever I want to do. I have free will. I've never suggested that because there's no God, there's no free will. I suggest that in fact it's the opposite. There is no God, and therefore we all have free will. The future is completely indeterminate.
Well,
there is no sort of force or anything guiding my actions. There's no retribution. There's no God. There's no my baby died for a reason. Nothing. It's all just random. My baby died because my baby died. Cancer happens. There are horrible creatures that burrow through your eyeball and eat your brain. That's because that's how evolution worked, and that's what it is. I don't want to think that God made that thing.
I think that where, at least I've seen some of the ideology around atheism, and there's a new kind of, I think what's taking place from the old Protestant Reformed notions of determinism is a new biological determinism. And so the question of free will is not at all resolved from the atheist side of the spectrum. There is a biological determinism that's being advocated in many places that says you don't really have free will, that your genetic predeterminations, your biological, your hormonal, and your chemical predeterminations effectively render you without a free will.
Well, it's an assemblage of random things. Right, I'm the sperm that happened to make it to the egg first, right? And I'm and I happen to have these kinds of parents that happen to raise me in this sort of way, and I happen to have this experience that made me realize that there is no God, whatever. There's this huge amount of completely random particles bouncing around, and that's what life is. And it's not pre-thought, it's not designed, it's squirmed its way into the shapes that it is. That's my thought, and that's my atheism.
So I think that that would probably not be deterred by one returning from the dead. Like if you had an apparition, if tonight somebody visited you from the dead, do you think that you'd wake up in the morning and you'd be like, hey, I was wrong. God's real. The afterlife is real. Or would you think, man, that was some crazy stuff. I had some bad pizza before I went to bed.
Right. You know, I contend that being an atheist does not mean that you are convinced that there is no God. It means that you have no evidence that there is a God. Mm-hmm. If God appeared in this room, just a vision, and he appeared to me and he said, I'm God, and here I'll show you, blah, blah, blah. Of course, I would say, wow, there is a God. I have evidence that there is now a God. I've seen God.
You wouldn't think it was just a psychotic break?
I mean, it would depend on the circumstances. If we were both in the room and you said, dude, I saw him too. I was like, what color was the rope? Did you see the gold thing?
Right.
Did we both have a psychotic break? I mean, maybe there's some kind of gas in here. Yeah. I mean, I given all the evidence, I would believe in God. And then if a scientist came in and said, okay, well, actually,
I can prove
we rigged a projector and da-da-da-da, then I'd be like, oh, okay, cool. And now my mind has changed back because the evidence that I've now been presented with has convinced me of this. Being a scientist means you believe what you believe until you're proven wrong. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, and you invite doubt. You know, I invite you to prove that there's a God. I want to know. I would love for there to be a God. I would love for there to be a reason. Honestly, it would be so cool if, you know, when horrible things happen, I think, well, you know, there's a reason and things are good and it all.
But would you love that if it made demands on how you live your life and who you are?
I don't know how. Like, I don't know what you mean. How would I be different if I strive to be a good person? What would be different if my
there would be somebody else determining what good was, not you.
Well, I mean, I believe that is the way that life is. I mean, we sort of agree as a society what's good and what's bad. I mean, even if I have a predilection to rape someone, right? And don't really know that, you know, that's just how I feel, so I should just do it. As a society, and we've lived thousands, millions of years, and seen the repercussions that rape has on people, and and as a society, we've decided that it's just not. We're not going to do that, even though we want to. We're not going to, because I'll be honest, I want to rape people. I see a beautiful woman, and for all I can think about is having sex. Wow, what would that, I'm a man. I want to reproduce. That's sort of what I think. It's not necessarily against her will, but you know what I mean. Right. It's like I'm thinking impure thoughts all the time. That is how I go. And however, because of society and of us all agreeing to these rules, I'm going to be polite and I'm going to be nice and I'm going to behave the way that I behave. I mean, I like to think that if I see that somebody's being hurt by my actions, that just intrinsically I would not want to do that. But I don't know if it's intrinsic or if it's just because I've been raised that way. I mean, I don't know because I've been raised that way.
Right.
Which kind of goes into this another question that I have.
Sure. we could follow that thread for a while.
Okay. Yeah.
We should talk about sin sometime.
But I mean, when back to the whole thing, the hell thing. When we talk about being a sinner and then repenting, and then you go to heaven instead of hell because you repented.
Right.
I'm fascinated by serial killers and stuff like that, and almost all serial killers, almost invariably, there are very few exceptions, have had horrible childhoods of absolute torture and just the worst, and as well as head injuries, and there's things, right, and so their view of the world is completely skewed, right? I mean, it's even if it's bad, it's like there's something completely wrong, completely skewed. You have been beaten into this shape that you would not normally have achieved, mm-hmm. right? That person, can they be redeemed if their brain is out? You know what I mean? It's like, you mentioned Jeffrey Dahmer. That is a guy who has a brain malfunction. I mean, it's not it's something, I believe it isn't something that's curable. He actually has no empathy. He as he's torturing somebody who's screaming and yelling, he's just fascinated by it. He doesn't get it. He doesn't see himself in that way. He doesn't think, wow, this would be a terrible
What would
thing.
that be like if it was me?
Yeah, so that person certainly can't go, I was wrong, It doesn't have that capacity. And it's not because he made bad choices, necessarily. It could be because he was beaten half to death every day of his life when he was a child, And what about schizophrenics, who actually see things, right? I see that there's this horrible baby being murdered right here, and there's a person in there, so I'm gonna try to save that baby and kill that person. Well, the baby didn't exist, and you just killed an innocent man, right? I mean, these things are how does redemption fit into that? Does that person go to hell? Does Jeffrey Dahmer be born? Jeffrey Dahmer might not be a great example, but a good example would be the psycho guy, what's his name? Ed Gein, okay? Just tortured, and kept in a basement, just constantly berated, and just was not allowed to live a life, dominated by his mother, who just tortured him all the time, right? He has no, he's the way that he is because of what was done to him, not because of choices that he made, right? So will he be punished then? Because later on he does make a choice, right? He says, "Oh, I'm gonna kill women and skin them and make suits out of them," because he is completely insane because of what was done to him. Therefore, I contend that his choices aren't really the choices of a man who makes choices. They are choices of an insane, rabid, crazy person whose brain is completely different from mine. So what does God do with Ed Gein?
Well, I have no idea. That's God's. That's the function of God. That's exactly why I defer to God. Is that I don't think that you and I have the capacity to sort that out, and that God does, specifically because he. And this is the positive aspect, because he made the chessboard, because he knows how to evaluate those factors in ways that you and I can't and won't ever be able to. So there is a deferring of that kind of judgment, and I think this is ultimately what it means when this horribly misquoted text is used, "Judge not lest you be judged." Like, it's not about not having any kind of perspective in the world. It's about having the humility to say there's some things that we're not going to sort out. Like, we don't have the capacity to. But what I would say is, where I would return a critique about that exact same kind of notion, is that if there's not some sense of justice and judgment in the world, like, what's in lieu of that, what should we do? Like, if we get to, as a society, a place where we can determine who that guy is when he's 3, should we call the herd? I mean, that's a logical, rational thing to do. As a society, to do in utero neurological scan and say, oh, this one's going to be a bad one, better get rid of it.
Well, that's what I say. It's like, in Scandinavia, Iceland, there is no
They've eradicated Down syndrome,
right?
Yeah.
Because people choose to abort babies that have Down syndrome. And my job as a social worker is to work with people with developmental disabilities, and people with Down syndrome are among my favorite people on the entire earth.
Mine too.
And they're just sweet, wonderful. You tend to be sweet, wonderful people who are innocent and wide-eyed and love life and are curious. Everything I want to be, really.
Wonderful people.
Yeah. And in On Killing, the book On Killing, there's a determination that about 2% of the population are true psychopaths, have absolutely no empathy, don't know what that is, don't know what that's like, it's a problem in their brain. If we could, in utero, find that we could just find people that will have absolutely no empathy, will have no way to relate to another human being, that would be different. Would I abort a child that has no chance? Maybe. Maybe. I wouldn't abort a child with Down syndrome, but I might abort a child that I knew would absolutely not be able to relate to his fellow man, would have no empathy. That's just, it's a horrible, maybe not horrible to them. I don't think that Ted Bundy thought it was horrible that he killed people. That was his life. It's who he was. He was, he would have gone on until he was an old man, being a happy person, probably. But he was born this way. He was born in this brokenness that thus far science has no way of fixing. And
well, let me play that just a little bit.
Yeah.
Let's tweak it just a hair because I think it's interesting. Okay, well, what if we can't tell in utero? Because I think that there's an in utero distancing. There's an other making of being in utero. What if we can't tell until they're 2? Yeah,
then grind them up. Yeah, I'm very hesitant to say, oh, I would abort a baby that has no empathy. I mean, a lot of CEOs and stuff. There's lots of psychopaths that make their lives, that make a life. But is the world a better place because of Lee Iacocca? Who was able to sit in a room and say, well, it costs more to fix the car than it does to just pay out lawsuits and with people dying, so just let them die. It's it's cheaper. That's a person with no empathy. That is a person who doesn't understand how humans work, right? Is the world a better place without Jeff Bezos? Probably. I don't know. Probably.
I find that my place works better in the world, like personally. Like so you seem to view that deferral of justice as a crutch, and maybe it is. Maybe that's an accurate definition of that. But what I would say is that it allows the world to be in reason. It allows me to not have to worry about Jeff Bezos. It allows me to not have to try to take on those things. And why that's meaningful is that I think there's a little bit of a miscalculation, at least in the way you stated it. I think from the Christian perspective, this deferral of judgment is not at least primarily vindictive. It's not like somebody hurt me and they're going to get theirs, at least not from the Christian worldview. I think what it is that I can operate my life according to what I think are God's directions for how to be a good person, a whole person. Because I think that's what the Bible is designed to do. It's made to create people who are whole, whose lives work the way that they were intended to work. It allows me to do that by deferring. So when I come up against something that's wrong, or in fact, in particular in the last few weeks, I've been dealing with a person who really is evil. And what I recognize in myself is that I don't want to respond like a Christian. I want to respond in defense. I want to respond in violence. I want to respond in anger. I want to respond in all the things that I know cause humans to be broken. And there I find them, right at home, ready to emerge. And one mechanism for learning how to live what we would call righteous or whole, a right life, is to be able to defer and to say, that's not my job. I'm not supposed to work out justice. That's not the place that I'm supposed to fulfill. I'm supposed to fulfill mercy and kindness and love. That's my job.
Right. And
so my capacity to defer judgment of the unrighteous, of the evil, actually allows space in the world for me to be good.
I am cognizant of that, and I'm not suggesting at all that the idea of God judging is for vengeance.
Uh-huh.
To say, that person killed my child, even though we don't know who he is, he'll be judged. that's not to make me feel good that he's being
Hurt.
that he's going to, that there's
Right.
going to be vengeance for him, because he may be judged to be okay, right? Because he may
Right.
redeem himself or whatever. But it's just this idea that I don't have to worry about it.
Right.
There is a higher power that is
Right.
that's overseeing things, and although I don't understand the reasons, and you could say, "Oh, my child is with God," that makes me feel good. It makes me feel good, right? It makes me feel better that there's an overseer, and that things are going to be okay, regardless of how horrible. When horrible things happen, whatever, maybe the guy will, maybe I can feel like, oh, I'd be happy if he's, burning in hell for eternity. That may not be the case, but my suggestion isn't that that's the resolution and that's why I believe it, or
It's
why
the
a
order.
Christian believe it. It's just the fact that things happen for a reason, and that okay, this person is, my child was taken away from me. I don't understand why, but there's a reason why, and I am going to trust and I'm going to defer to this higher power, and I'm going to be okay. I think that's one of the reasons that religion is important to people. And again, it's that fear of
But
just
that's
it happened for
but
no
it's
reason.
as true so that function of religion is it's kind of regardless of whether or not it's a fact, right? Because if
Right.
Christianity was true, that would be the
Right.
case, and if Christianity were false, that would be the case.
I think that's fantastic.
Yeah.
I think that's I think religion has a few merits. I mean, the merits don't outweigh the horrors that it has visited upon the world. But there are, there are certainly people who, because of faith, they've become more still, more calm, more trusting. You know what I mean? I mean, there are those aspects that are wonderful. The fact that they hate gay people, that's a problem with me.
Well, they shouldn't hate anybody.
Right, but you know what I mean. It's,
Right.
So by and large, if my daughter was killed and taken from me, well, first of all, I have no idea what I would do. I have no idea how I would feel, and I don't know if the rest of my life would just be absolute misery. It might be. I don't know. But it won't make me feel better or worse to know that it could have been it was a random person. She was in the wrong place at the wrong time or whatever. That's how life goes. Because that is what I believe. And so it goes against me sometimes, but that's how it goes. I don't need a God, and I don't need it. And I feel a lot of people do need it, but just the hell thing, the redemption. Are there people who, what about? Do you believe that there is a hell where people are eternally punished? Eternally punished? Forever with no chance of redemption once they've reached that point? I mean, doesn't redemption mean that at any moment you can change?
So let me give you a few premises of faith, and these are things that I believe without empirical evidence. I believe that people have eternal souls. I think that that's a part of what it means to be made in the image of God. That we are eternal creatures. Like there's something inside of us that's more than the sum of our parts.
But we don't remember. We don't continue a soul from. Like, how is it that you just remember being 40 years old or however?
I think there's something inside of us that once it's made, it goes on forever.
But did yours start when you were
I don't
made?
think so.
So do you believe in
what
reincarnation?
do I
or
know? But no, I think that spontaneous life generates, and from that point, it has an eternal component. It doesn't ever. There's a part of us that goes on eternally, and I think that part of us that goes on eternally is what's mentioned in the creation narrative when God breathes into Adam. It's the thing that distinguishes man from animal. It's the thing that distinguishes man from the rest of the creation. He becomes a special creature in that there's something from God inside of him. That's just a belief. It's
right, yeah.
I can't pull yours out and show it to you
Sure.
or weigh it or anything. And as such, I think that sets very, very high stakes on the life that we live. I think that we recognize this when we value life, when we talk about tragedy, the fact that we all believe that death is bad and that it certainly shouldn't happen to children, and that's even worse, is a marker that this space that we have in this body is the consequential moment of being, and what flows out of this time that we have here affects the rest. So we have little microcosms of that. The decision I make today affects tomorrow and the next day and the next day. And there's accumulation of that through your whole life that creates a consequence for eternity. And that's a high stakes proposition. But I think that the consequences of our life go on forever. So for instance, when someone lives their life saying, I don't believe in God, I don't see him. So when we look at two things, when we look at the same thing, I see God, you see chance. And when you create a life that says, I don't want that. I don't want God. I don't want to see it. I don't want to be beholden to it. I don't recognize the order. I don't recognize the creation. I don't recognize his place in his world. That the consequence of that is that he says, okay, if you curate your life to say, I'm not a part of your world, then you live eternity saying, you're not a part of my world. And that kind of consequence construct is what I see in the afterlife.
So basically, the afterlife for me would just be an afterlife without a God?
Separated from God, yeah.
So, and would that include the burning fire thing? Because that's
I don't know. I mean, that imagery is important in what it's connoting. What it means for sure is that it's bad. It's not good.
So, you said when you live your life without God, it's like I don't believe it. I don't want to see it. I'm very adamant about the fact that I don't say I don't want to see it. I say I don't see it.
Have you ever?
There's a difference.
Do you ever try to cultivate seeing it if it were there? Like, do you do experiments with truth that way? Like,
what do you mean?
Like, do you ever engage in experience and say, what would this be like? Like, where is God? Like, if God were true, what would that be like? Like, have you played games like that?
I mean, of course, right? That's just thinking, right? I mean,
that's interesting, isn't it?
I mean, the vast majority of people believe in God, and I just am like, wow, okay, what's that like?
Yeah.
But I look at it as though, as the vast majority of people believe that that an eclipse was a giant creature in the sky stealing the sun for a little bit, and then eventually we learned what that was. I think eventually science will weed out all of the little things that make us believe that there's a supernatural force.
I don't believe that for a second.
Well, I know you don't.
I don't believe it for a second based on empirical reasons, though. I don't believe it for a second because there have always been people like you. I mean, the Bible has all kinds of scriptures in the Old Testament from thousands and thousands of years ago, that verified thousands of years ago, talking about people postulating exactly that premise. So there have always been people who are religious, and there have always been people who are irreligious. I mean, Voltaire was what, in the 1700s?
Right.
Like, there have always been atheists. There have always been people who reject whatever presentation of God there is in the world. So that leads me to think that your position is a novel. It's something there's always been people advocating that notion, and persistently people continue to believe in something bigger than what they see. And I don't think that the scientific worldview and empiricism and materialism, for that matter, has really changed the score on whether or not people believe in the supernatural.
Well, I think, right. I think people want, like I said before, people want there to be a reason. People are afraid of chaos.
Or they're built
or
to
they're
see
programmed.
That way.
Or they're programmed to. Anyway, yeah, I just I feel like like the reason that I am okay with there not being a God is because I'm okay with chaos. I'm fine with it. You know.
Are you though?
Yeah, I think.
I mean, you would not like your life to be in chaos.
My life isn't chaos. Chaos is all around us. It's
But
molecules slamming into each other.
Chaos is a civil war. Chaos is nothing dependable. Chaos is I don't know if I
Nothing is
die
dependable.
in the next moment or not.
I could go home and my wife could be dead. It's I don't.
But you have a
It's like,
feasibility structure, and that's not chaos. Like it could be the case that some alien civilization nukes the sun tomorrow and it doesn't rise in the morning. But that's not. There's a feasibility structure that says for the last 40 and 50 years, the sun has risen every morning, and you order your life around it. So something could intervene in that.
I can assume that.
But a chaos would be, on Thursday the sun doesn't rise, on Friday it does. Like, that's chaos.
That's not my definition. I mean, chaos is basically there is no
order.
There is no guarantee of order. There's no guarantee of what happens next, right? And, the scientific view about how the sun works makes me believe that once it's destroyed, it's not coming back. I mean, maybe it does come back, and there's a scientific reason that it does not, then I learned something, But I'm going to hell.
I hope not.
Basically, is the gist of it, right? You and I, we're good in this life. We get to hug each other, but in hell, there's going to be this river.
Gulf.
There's going to be this river between us, so we won't be able to hug each other, right? Even though we love each other.
That's
just a little bit crazy.
I want to give one comment on that,
Okay.
because it is crazy to me too, and I don't want that to be. I don't want that to be the case.
Right.
As much as you want God to be the case, I don't want that to be the case. So I guess we're both prisoners of our own.
Just show me him.
Worldview.
Just hey, show me the river. Go ahead.
There's one important thing that the Bible does say about hell, and it says that. Actually, two things in two different places. In one place, it says that God is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance in Christ Jesus. Like, he doesn't want that for anybody. I think that's why God's will is important to me.
He's like, it's with a heavy heart that I cast you into hell forever. I don't want it.
I think what I would say is that in order for reality to be, these things exist. Like, the way the world works, the way that reality is that this is a condition. Like, you could say, I could say, I wish that people didn't kill themselves, but free will necessitates that. Like, there are cause and effect conditions, and I think that eternal consequences are cause and effect. I think that's what God's saying. It's not like I'm not relishing. I don't have any interest. I don't have any desire that people live in suffering. I don't think God has a desire that people die of starvation. I think he created a world where that doesn't have to be the case, and I think he created a world where nobody has to go to hell. But we get to play a part in that, and we have decided that the world runs in a different way than it could. And so there's this collaboration of wills that create outcomes that are sometimes very negative.
Powerless to change that.
I don't think he's powerless. I don't think he's powerless at all. And I think that in the end he does change it.
So the starving child that dies.
Right.
That guy goes to heaven, I'm assuming.
Oh, so? Yeah.
But Ed Gein, is Ed Gein in hell? I mean, he was a perfectly beautiful, normal child who was tortured and horribly abused his entire life and turned into a monster. He was turned into a monster. He was not a monster. So does he go to heaven? Does he go to hell? Maybe you don't know. There's a lot of information that we don't have, but you know what I mean. I feel like that it's unfair. I guess that God will make a judgment based on your experiences. The way that you were raised, all the decisions, you made a decision, and then in the end he tallies it all up, and then bam, it's heaven for you or hell for you, but forever.
But you kind of have, like, I would say you have your cake and eat it too, but it's more like you have you smell the sewer and drink it too. Like, there's no good outcome for you. Like, it's either that the world is created and it's not fair, or there is no such thing as fairness. Those are the only two options for you.
There is no such thing as fairness.
Yeah, so you just live in a bad world.
I do, yeah. I live in a world where people hurt each other, and it sucks, and I hate it, you know. And I tell my children, it's like, this is how it is, and you please work hard to make it better, you know. Please,
but it can't
please
really.
do what you can. Of course, it can be better. We could save one starving child.
Yeah,
you can feed a child, you know. I mean, we can make it better, you know. And we can lament the decisions made by politicians and that they're bombing people in Yemen. I mean, we can lament that, and we can vote against it, and we can do our best. But in the end, it is extremely frustrating. It's extremely frustrating. And when you factor in that some of the people are being bombed because of God, that just is just insanity to me. You know, I believe this, you believe that, I'm going to kill you. You know, that's crazy. But anyway, we need to wrap up.
Yeah.
I hope that our friendship lasts for eternity, and that I can hug you
too.
after we die. I don't believe that there's an afterlife. I hope I just fade to black thinking, oh, I love Matt. As I fade to black.
It seems like we've talked about this before. Have we done a show about this before?
About what?
About hell?
Mm-mm.
At the dining room in... we'll have to look back through the catalog, because I think we've had parts of this conversation
this is the way this show works. It's like we talk about something, and then it gets into, and we talked about free will for half the time today.
Right.
Because honestly, free will is going to be the backbone of every single thing. That's the difference, right?
It's the substance of reality.
Yeah, it is for sure the main talking point. But all right.
Well, that was a
you.
controversial and compassionate conversation.
Yes. I love you, and I'm
Love
going
you
to
too.
cross the divide, cross the river, and give you a hug. All right, man. See ya.